So, 13th century. There's Thomas. My students at school think I'm old enough to have actually taken that picture, but I disclaim that. But anyway, he was born in 1225. We said last week that Francis died in 1226. So as I say, their lives just barely overlap. They certainly never met each other. Thomas Aquinas was born into an extraordinarily complicated time. And this is, I just want to say up front, everything that I'm about to say in the next 5 minutes or so is demonstrably false. Because it's a generalization, and you know how it is, right? All generalizations are false. But I think at least it's a stab at trying to describe some of the themes of this time. And this is tough to do, and I don't feel real good that I'm giving an adequate description, but at least it'll be something to work with as we try to frame the moment in which Thomas found himself laboring on behalf of the church and on behalf of the truth of God. It's the end of the period of the Crusades. We talked a couple of weeks ago about some of the effects of the Crusades. This, of course, was a combination of many things: opening contacts with the East, rediscovering some of the classical sources, bringing them into Europe. The trade was also producing a kind of new class of wealthy people, and there was at the same time, by virtue of the church's involvement in these and the kind of disintegrating credibility of the Crusades, a collateral disintegration of the credibility of the church and of the leadership of the church, and all of this was creating a sort of spirit at the time of some skepticism and some cynicism, you might say, in some quarters. So while the church still had a fair amount of prestige, there was at least underneath it a kind of sabotaging of that by virtue of this bigger world that now seemed to be created in people's minds. And this is the moment in which Thomas Aquinas comes along. The attitude probably you'd use to describe this would be skepticism in general, not overt skepticism, certainly not the kind of thing we find today, which is vastly more skeptical, but a kind of insidious skepticism that seemed to be infiltrating the minds and hearts of people. Feudalism was ending. In some ways, it was the plague that brought about the end of the feudal period, and that is certainly true. And then you think about a little more closely what actually is happening. Where did the plague come from? The plague came from towns. Towns were invented really toward the end of this period, because what happened was that contact with the East produced wealth, and the wealth was based on trade, and the trade took place at crossroads. And so these kind of famous medieval towns that began to develop that were not so much a part of the feudal world, you see. The feudal world was one of agriculture. But now you begin to see places where people are getting a living not by agriculture but by trade. And the trade is coming from contacts with the East. And they built these towns. They were wonderful places, but not very clean, you know. The sewage would run down the streets. I mean, from a modern point of view, we would be horrified. But at the time, it seemed like kind of a step in the right direction. They didn't understand sanitation the way we do. And so the vermin in the city and so on, and the kind of crowded populations did create a sort of opportunity for these diseases to get going, especially the bubonic plague, of course, but other diseases as well. And they didn't necessarily appreciate all that was, you know, the causes of some of these things. The towns were called at the time free towns. And they were free because they would work out with local nobility what was called a charter. And the charter would protect them from certain encroachments of the local nobility and provide for them a kind of autonomy. So people who could make it to a town sometimes viewed that as escaping from virtual slavery. And so the towns tended to grow at this time, and the images we have of the medieval town, the fairs, the jugglers, the art entertainers, and all of that was sort of an innovation that came toward the end of the period of the Crusades. But as I say, it also created problems of its own. It did become a basis for some rising wealth. It became a basis for a kind of independent population, and it was in the towns that you begin to see the beginnings of what were called the medieval universities. So universities that became an educational system separate from the church. See, up until this time, education happened in the monasteries. But now free towns, born out of trade, begin to create their own educational apparatus that is not under the immediate supervision of the church, and therefore can entertain ideas while not openly hostile to the teaching of the church. Nevertheless, a little bit more academic freedom going on, a little bit more freedom to think about possible ways of viewing things that aren't exactly textbook Christian theology. And so the universities represent a kind of interesting venue for new ideas to be discussed, and that, of course, is immediately informed by these views that are coming from the East, classical, skepticism, the Greco-Roman, poetry, philosophy, politics, art, kind of the Islamic influence, which was critical of the Christian faith. All of these mixed together sort of found a hearing in the universities. And the scholars of the day began to do lip service to the Christian faith while at the same time entertaining ideas that would be quite different from traditional Christian understanding. That was called double truths. So you could affirm something to be true theologically, but at the point of science, we're not so sure it's true. You see, that idea. So this is going on, and all of this is creating a kind of atmosphere of a little bit of almost dishonesty, I guess you'd say, in the academic world. This classical humanism was producing a kind of skepticism along with it. And then you mix into this Aristotle's philosophy. The Islamic world had been fascinated with Aristotle for a long time. And part of the inspiration for their own scientific enterprises was their reading of Aristotle. They weren't reading the original Aristotle in Greek, but they were reading kind of translations of him, and even that was serving to give them an interest in nature and this world and science that was lost on the Christian West at the same time. So the Baghdad period, kind of the golden age of Islamic progress in science, left them, put them way ahead of, in a sense, the Christian world. Well, now all of that scientific advance is trickling in to Europe, and Aristotle is coming in. Aristotle was viewed as the great enemy because the Middle Ages had been dominated by Augustine, who was a Platonist. And so the Christian theology of the Middle Ages was really characterized and overshadowed by a fairly Platonic point of view. The great critic of Plato was his best student, Aristotle, Plato was all about truth up there. Aristotle's about truth down here. You recall Raphael's painting. Plato's pointing up. Aristotle's pointing out. Plato's got one finger pointing toward heaven, the ideal world. Aristotle's got four fingers, the particular, science, this world, you see, and that really captures the difference between them. Rationalism, empiricism. Well, the church viewed Aristotle as kind of a bad guy because the critique Aristotle made of Plato was becoming the critique that Islam was making of the Christian faith, you see. And it put sort of the Christian thinkers back on their heels in a kind of defensive posture. And people were beginning to feel like, well, we can still believe this over here like Christians, but over here we have to grant, it seems like Aristotle's getting a lot of the right answers, and that kind of almost splitting up, fragmenting of a conviction of faith was really undermining Christian confidence. So this is the kind of thing that's happening. This is the world into which we find Thomas Aquinas appears. And he's really responding to it. What's called the classical synthesis is his attempt to say, wait a minute, all truth is finally God's truth. Scientific truth, metaphysical truth, theological, this worldly, that worldly, all of it is God's truth. And so the truth of the Trinity is part of a seamless continuum with 2 + 2 = 4. Science, all of these things find their heart in Christ. And that was really, in some ways, in a simple way, kind of the great challenge that he faced and the great effort that he put in. A little bit about his life, just for fun. He was born in Aquina, which is on Sicily, hence his name Thomas Aquinas. He was born of nobility. He was the seventh son of a guy named Count Randolph. And so he was born into that late feudal medieval period of time. He was born into some wealth, born in a castle, you know. He was brilliant. That was recognized quite early. And usually it was understood that if a kid was brilliant, that they were going to go into a religious career of some kind. And so really from a very early date, it was taken for granted that Thomas would be a monk. The expectation was that he would be a Benedictine monk because that was the most prestigious, well-recognized order of monks that was out there. Of course, the Franciscans were just getting started, and there were many joining them, but they didn't have the prestige yet. The Benedictines had been around for hundreds of years, and so it was more or less assumed that Thomas would enter a Benedictine order, and that was the plan, and he had no argument with it. He had a good education. But when he went to Naples, which was when he was 14 and was north on the Italian peninsula, he was exposed to a different order of monks. They'd been founded only about 50 years earlier by a guy named Dominic. The order was called the Dominicans. They were founded in 1170. And the Dominicans were an order of academic monks. They were really recognizing the challenge that was being faced by the church by virtue of all of these new thoughts that were flowing in from the East. And so the Dominicans were attempting to develop a kind of apologetic on behalf of the church. The Benedictines were known more for kind of their piety and their sort of monkish way of life, you know, and so on. Copying ancient manuscripts, and these guys were doing more cutting-edge academic work, really out in front, really meeting the challenge of the day. And Thomas Aquinas, with his brilliant mind, was really drawn to that kind of activity. So it created a bit of a crisis when he said to his parents, "I want to become a Dominican." His parents were part of a wealthy family, and they had already made deals with the Benedictines, political arrangements, that their brilliant son, you see, would become not only a Benedictine, but eventually the abbot of Monte Cassino, which was the premier Benedictine monastery there in central Italy. And so when Thomas dropped that little hand grenade, they weren't very happy. But Thomas was determined, and at age 19, against his father was dead by then, but against his parents' or his mother's express wishes and the whole leaning of his family, he became a Dominican. Caused a huge disruption in the family. And he wrote shortly after these words, quote, "When parents are not in such want that they have a great need of the services of their children, the children can enter the religious life without the consent of their parents, even against their expressed will, because, having passed the age of puberty, any free man has the right to dispose of himself in the choice of a state of life. Above all, if it is a matter of the service of God, it is better to obey the Father of spirits in order that we may live than the parents of our flesh." So, this was his response. Not the typical writings of a 19-year-old, but you know, there it is. So he joined the Dominicans, and that did cause a bit of a crisis with his family. So much so that his mother actually got a couple of the older brothers of Thomas in on a little scheme to kidnap him and bring him back to the family home and beat some sense into him. So Thomas was there at this Dominican monastery, and they were watching like from the bushes, you know, and every day he'd go out and get water or something. And so they were watching for an opportune moment, and that moment came one day, and literally they grabbed him. I don't know, put duct tape on his mouth or something, you know, and they threw him into the back of an ox cart and took him home. Who says church history isn't high adventure? I mean, come on, you know, who would make up a story like this? So they take him back and lock him into his own home in the castle and keep him there as a prisoner for 1 full year, hoping that they would kind of break his will, get him to see the light, bow to family pressure, and divert his energies back in the direction that was originally intended. Well, all during this year, month by month, he continues to observe the Dominican order, the prayers, the disciplines, and so on. They begin feeling a little guilty after a while, you know. Thomas is very cordial, very gracious. He actually begins tutoring a couple of his older sisters and teaching them, you know, the ABCs and some stuff. And, you know, all of this, he's being but he doesn't yield to their pressure. Finally, these same two brothers cook up a scheme. I don't know if the mother was in on this or not. I rather doubt it. But they think, you know, the way to really get to Thomas is to get him to commit mortal sin. And so, while he's there locked up in a virtual prison, they go out and they hire a woman of the night. It's true. And they bring her in and tell her what to do, you know, her peculiar expertise, and introduce her into his room in the middle of the night. Reginald is the most faithful biographer of the life of Thomas Aquinas. He was a close associate, probably his closest friend throughout his life. It's sort of like Watson to Sherlock Holmes. Reginald was the man who was always there and recorded. And so Reginald gives us the following account of what happened on this occasion. Quote, "A pretty young girl with all the charms of the temptress was introduced into the room where he was sleeping. He awakened. He leaped up. He grabbed hold of a flaming firebrand and chased her out, and then proceeded to trace the sign of the cross on the door with the firebrand. And from that time on, by an angelic grace, he was never to experience any impulse of the flesh." So that was the end of that little plan. And once again, Thomas was able to best these people who were out to upset his career. Well, finally, the mother herself became so chagrined and embarrassed at what she was doing to the poor guy that she, letting no one know about it, actually orchestrated his escape. And so they did a kind of basket through the wall of the castle kind of deal, like Paul escaped from Damascus, you know, and they let him down, and the mother could later say, "Oh, he got away, oh, awful," you know, but at the same time, she was actually behind it. There was a horse conveniently right at the bottom there where he came down. He got on his horse, rode away into the night, and made it back to his Dominican monastery. And about the next year, this was, well, about the same time actually, 1245, he's 20 years old, he's enrolled in the school of Albertus Magnus, who was probably, I would say, the most famous, or at least one of two or three most famous Christian theologians, philosophers of the day, Albert the Great. The chances are, maybe if you've heard of him, most people have not heard of him, and the reason is because he was eclipsed by his greatest student. You know, that happens. That's what I always tell my students at the Oaks. In 100 years, people would have heard of me, except you guys are all so brilliant, you know, and so I'll be lost in time. But they're going to do great things. Well, that was kind of the way it is with Albert. He was a great teacher, a great Dominican, and really rising to the occasion of the challenges of the time. And because of Thomas's evident abilities, he was admitted to this very prestigious and restricted education. Not everybody could go to this school, but Thomas got in. However, the students there weren't so sure that Thomas really got in legitimately. They thought this was family connections. Thomas personally didn't look all that bright. I mean, I don't want to overstate this, but he was kind of a big guy. He was pretty portly. And he didn't look smart, you know? I mean, this picture probably is kind of a sort of very sympathetic, but they looked at him and they thought, this guy didn't get in here because of his brilliance. He got in here because somebody paid somebody. And so the students of Albert the Great, who weren't characterized by a high degree of Christian charity, gave Thomas the nickname, the Dumb Ox. You ever heard that? The Dumb Ox. Have you ever come across the Dumb Ox of Sicily? In your reading of church history, you know it's talking about Thomas Aquinas. This became a famous description. Well, he was called the Dumb Ox. Thomas, for his part, didn't try to defend himself, didn't rise, you know, correct these people. He just took it. He was a very humble guy. And so for some time, that was the nickname that was applied to him. That changed About 4 months into his time at this school, because all the students were required to write a paper, and as was the custom of the time, they would then stand up and deliver their paper to the critique of their fellow students. And so they'd read the paper and then be forced to respond to questions, finding holes in their logic. So Thomas had written such a paper, and when his turn came, he got up in front of the class and read his paper. And of course, the students gradually, had it dawn on them that this was in a different class entirely, that this kid was no ordinary mortal, that he was reading with he was reading a paper written with such insight, such meticulous detail, such care, such intelligence that they were obviously dealing with someone of vastly greater intellectual powers than any of them had. So at the end of reading the paper, Thomas stands there politely waiting for the critique, for the hard questions. Nobody had a word to say. Nobody could think of a good question to ask. They were afraid to try. So after a polite period of time, Thomas wandered, kind of lumbered back to his desk and sat down. At which time, Albertus Magnus, who was observing all of this, was said to have said words to this effect: "Gentlemen, it seems to me that the bellowing of this, quote, dumb ox will someday be heard through all the world," And at that point, the students realized how wrong they had been about Thomas, and he was quickly became one of the most highly esteemed and respected students there. And really that dominated, I would say, the rest of his career, realizing what a great contribution this was to the life of the church. At age 31, he was promoted to become a master of theology. That doesn't sound like a big deal to us. At the time, however, it was extraordinary. To be a master of theology was to be an official teacher of the church, sanctioned by the church. Usually, people were much older before they were accorded this particular honor. There was a church rule that required you be at least 35, but it was much more common to be quite a bit older than that. By special papal dispensation, Thomas was given this privilege at age 31. He didn't want it. He felt wholly inadequate to the task. He protested, but it was more or less forced upon him, and after some prayer and some tears, he finally assented to become a master of the church, which means from that point on, his responsibility was to give public lectures and be involved in education throughout the rest of his career, and that's really what he did at Mount Genevieve near the University of Paris. The bulk of his career was spent, really this was it, publishing, teaching, writing, and meeting the challenges of the day, and so that carried him forth from that point. He was so brilliant, he didn't write, he published much, he didn't write any of it, he dictated. So he would dictate to a secretary material that was so brilliantly written that even virtually the form that was dictated would be publishable. But what they found was they couldn't keep up with him. He would dictate so rapidly that one secretary couldn't take it down rapidly enough. And so actually he got to where he'd dictate to about 4 secretaries at once. But he would dictate on 4 different topics to 4 different secretaries at once. So it was, kind of bam, 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 3 or 4 sentences, then bam, 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 3 or 4 sentences, bam, 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 and then back to the first one, you see, and he'd always keep track of where he was. It's like these guys that play, 14 games of chess blindfolded and win every one of them. That's kind of what, this guy is just a transcendent genius. He's one of these guys that comes along every 300 or 400 years, and you're just awestruck at the brilliance of the man. And this was really the quality of intellect that Thomas had. So he published major works on major topics in his day that served in an immensely helpful way the church at that time, which was feeling, as I say, kind of knocked back on its heels a bit by the pressures that were coming from other forces. He, in particular, wrote a major commentary on Aristotle. Aristotle, who'd been viewed as the great enemy of the church, now, by virtue of the work of Thomas, becomes, in a sense, a friend of the church. Not on all points. I don't want to overstate this, but in a sense, what Thomas Aquinas did with Aristotle was something of what Augustine did with Plato. He took the Platonic view of things and made it serviceable to a way of expressing Christian truth. It's not a sellout, but it does mean you speak the truth of the Christian faith in language comprehensible in its time, you know. If we, as Christian people, try to talk to 21st century folks out there in the language of the 16th century, they're going to have a hard time following us. You know, because we need to find out what are the ways in which this culture understands things and communicate the truth in a relevant fashion in that culture. That's what Augustine did. That's what Thomas did. But Thomas left such an imprint with his Aristotelian sort of emphasis that to this day you'll find Roman Catholic theology has a kind of Aristotelian sound to it. For example, the most famous, doctrine maybe, or one of them, of the Catholic Church would be transubstantiation, right? Transubstantiation is what? That the substance of the bread and wine become the substance of the body and blood of Christ, but the accidents remain the same. You ever heard that? That's Aristotelian language. Substance, accidents, form, matter, that idea. Those are Aristotelian categories that Thomas then uses and makes serviceable to the church. I'm not saying anything about transubstantiation, you understand. I'm just saying that's one example of the way in which he would use distinctions and philosophical ideas from Aristotle to service the teaching of the church. So anyway, he writes quite a bit. Aristotle commentary is one. He met a great deal of the challenge of what was called Arabian skepticism, even in the Islamic world. This is very interesting. The idea of double truths was already current. There was a roughly contemporary Islamic philosopher theologian named Averroes. He actually subscribed to the notion of double truths because he realized that traditional Islamic teaching didn't square perfectly with Aristotelian science. And he actually developed the idea that things could be true in one realm but not in the other. It's called double truths. And Christian people were starting to embrace a little bit of that. Thomas attacked that. There was another idea called equipollens, that ultimate propositions could be argued with equal persuasion either way. It's some great truth. God exists. Beauty is, or whatever. You could argue with equal persuasion either way. And in the Islamic world, they were kind of embracing this sort of skeptical attitude. And in the Christian world, it was beginning to have a similar kind of influence. And Thomas met that. He was saying, no, all truth is in God. All truth is God's truth, and it all is therefore agreeable with other aspects of itself. It's not self-contradictory. You can't have truth contradicting truth, you see. Truth is truth, and it all is a great whole, and it all has its core in Christ. And this is what, and for my money, that's a very helpful thing. I wish another Thomas Aquinas would come along in the early 21st century to do something like that, because we live at a time of incredible intellectual fragmentation, don't we? And to have this great recovery of a sense of the unity of truth in one great reality, Christ, would be a helpful contribution to me. Well, that's what Thomas was trying to do. His most famous works are called the Summa Theologia, which is a great systematic theology, and the Summa Contra Gentile, which is a great apologetic defense of the Christian faith, especially against Islamic understanding. Good reading, not easy reading, and you have to get your brain into the scholastic style. He writes in a way that's kind of questions, answers, objections. It's a rather kind of, you would say, almost stilted style, but if you kind of get into it, it's not that bad, and it's good for your brain. Just a few little anecdotal things about him here. He was said to be in his appearance lofty. He was tall, portly. It's kind of, he would shop at the, well, anyway. He was tanned. He had that Sicilian tan, He was bald. In fact, he was described as having an unusually large head with a little hair on it. So that was his appearance. He was absent-minded in the extreme. This is my favorite quality of Thomas. I get great encouragement personally from this one, especially. Keep trying to tell my wife, it's a sign of genius, honey, but I don't think she's buying it. But anyway, there's many stories, humorous stories really about Thomas. They actually had assigned 4 monks to follow Thomas around just to make sure he didn't screw up, it's just to put it bluntly. Because he would do the most outrageous things just by not by malice, just by absent-mindedness. He was invited once to have dinner with the King of France. I mean, he teaches in France. The king was very much aware of Thomas and wanted to meet him personally, invited him over. And so the 4 monks come along, to try to keep Thomas from doing anything too socially inappropriate. And so he's sitting there at dinner, and the king is trying to engage Thomas, the greatest genius in the world, in some kind of conversation. And Thomas clearly has his mind wandering. He's just not with it. And the monks are trying to kick him under the table. Thomas, would you pay attention to the King of France, for Pete's sake? And finally, right in the middle of this, as Reginald tells the story, Thomas, whose hand was very large, just pounds it down on the table. Bam! And all the goblets go flying, and the silverware, is jumbled around. And Thomas cries out and says, "I've got it! The clinching argument against the Manichaean heresy." Thomas, please, And but the king actually, to his credit, realized this is the genius of the man. Immediately summoned a secretary to come in and take down dictation from Thomas about the clinching heresy, or clinching answer to the Manichaean heresy. So anyway, that was not every genius is absent-minded, but some are, and Thomas was one of them. He was kind of monomaniac in his love of and pursuit of truth. No diversions really in his life, no hobbies. No day, his perfect world was just always staying on the task. Again, Reginald tells us one account where he was in the city of Paris, and it was kind of an exciting place to visit, and people would go there, and there'd be always kind of entertainments and that sort of thing happening. And so the monks took a day off and went down with Thomas, and Thomas didn't want to go, but sort of bowing to the peer pressure, went on this little excursion through the city of Paris. One of the monks was pointing out to him something, some novelty or some such thing that was of interest, and Thomas said to him, in truth, I would much rather right now be reading one of the commentaries of Chrysostom on St. Matthew than being here in Paris. That was just kind of the way he was. He just wanted to be in his books and in his studies. And so that was really the nature of his life. He was a man of, I think, authentic, deep humility. I don't think he ever had a real sense of his own genius, kind of like sometimes a horse doesn't have a sense of its own strength. He was so preoccupied with his work and doing it right and doing it in a way that honored Christ that it wasn't like he ever reflected, wow, I'm Thomas Aquinas. It's kind of, it wasn't. But there's one story in particular that I think is sort of interesting. There was an occasion where in the monastery that Thomas labored, kind of a junior grade monk was visiting from a different monastery who knew of Thomas Aquinas but had never seen him. And this junior grade monk was ordered by the abbot of the monastery to go into town, go into Paris, get some groceries, and bring them back for the use of the order there in the monastery, and to take one of the monks with you. And so this guy goes out. This would be like a buck private, or something. And the first guy he runs into is Thomas Aquinas, who's walking down the hall to his work. And of course, Thomas never wore any clothing that would indicate that he was anything more than another monk. And so this guy orders Thomas immediately to come with him into Paris to help, because he's a big guy, he can carry the load. And Thomas immediately obeys, doesn't protest. Wait a minute, pal, don't you know I'm Thomas Aquinas? I've got work to do. And so he follows him into town, carries humbly carries, never says a word of protest, like this was just, what God had ordained for him that day. When this junior grade monk learned what he'd done, he was absolutely appalled, and you can imagine, to think that he had diverted Thomas Aquinas from his labors to do this, but this was kind of the way he was. He was just a man of very, very almost unaware of himself. He had quite a sense of humor. There's a story of Thomas on one occasion working away in the cubicle in this room, and as a practical joke, one of the other brothers goes to a window and looks out the window and says, "Thomas, come and look, there's a flying ox out here." Thomas gets up from his work, walks over to the window, looks out the window, no flying ox, walks back, sits down. At which time all the other brothers in the room just burst out laughing. Thomas, how can you be such an idiot? And Thomas said these words, I would rather believe that an ox could fly than that a monk could lie, you know. So, anyway, he was a powerful preacher. He was known for his very moving sermons, and people would come, travel long distances to hear him preach. It was kind of like the Great Awakening sort of thing. We see this occasionally where people were just so moved that there'd be open weeping and a sense of God's presence and conviction, that sort of thing. He was a man of deep prayer, and the universal testimony of his life is that as much as he spent time in study, he spent an extraordinary amount of time in prayer. So much so that it was at least thought by some that he got his insights as much from prayer as from genius, you know. And so he was not just a cerebral guy. He had a true heart of deep faith, and the most uncanny story. And I pass no judgment on this. I'll just leave it to your assessment what to make of this, but it probably is the most famous incident, which really does kind of stand out, is again recorded for us by Reginald in the following words, quote, an obscure passage had stopped him in Isaiah, and for a long time he fasted and prayed to obtain an understanding of it. And behold, one night Reginald heard him speaking. Reginald would always describe himself in the third person, you know. Reginald heard him speaking with someone in his room. But when the sound of the conversation had ceased, Friar Thomas called him, telling him to light the candle and take the manuscript on Isaiah. Then he dictated for an hour, after which he sent Reginald back to bed. But Reginald fell upon his knees, saying, quote, I will not rise from my knees until you have told me the name of him or of them with whom you have spoken for such a long time tonight. Finally, Friar Thomas began to weep, and forbidding him in the name of God to reveal the thing during Thomas's lifetime, confessed that the apostles Peter and Paul had come into his cell to instruct him on this passage. I don't know. I've never been visited, to be honest with you, by Peter or Paul, to my knowledge. But maybe Thomas was. It's certainly possible, but I'm just going to leave that to your assessment. I know we sometimes kind of think, well, this is the Middle Ages and everybody was kind of weird and superstitious. You know, they're not really. They lived in the same world we do. And Reginald is so faithful on so many points that it makes you take a text like this, which might be easy to dismiss as just kind of, you know, legendary embellishment. And at least we have to think about it, but I don't know. I'm going to leave it there. Thomas, toward the end of his life, was celebrating Mass on one occasion and froze. Just was paralyzed right in the middle of it. And there was this long, very awkward pause. And finally, some of the others realized that maybe there was some kind of health problem or something, so they went up and actually helped Thomas out of the chapel, and he didn't say a word. Something happened. Some people thought it was a stroke or some sort of health problem, but it was never really diagnosed. But he stopped writing. He stopped teaching. He just basically suspended all of his activity from that moment on. One of the few things he said in that final moment was to Reginald, and he said to him these words, Reginald, such things have been shown to me that it seems to me everything that I have written is just so much straw. So it's a very intriguing statement, and who knows what that means. I've sometimes wondered, was Thomas like the Apostle Paul, caught up to the third heaven and saw things it's not lawful for a man to speak? I don't know. But in any event, only about 2 weeks later, he was traveling with some other monks, kind of going along on some kind of short excursion, and collapsed. And he happened to have collapsed not far from a Benedictine monastery, Benedictine now. And they picked him up, of course, and took him into the monastery, wanting to provide any care that they could for him. But he died the next day. So he died on March 7th, 1274, at the age of 49. And it remains a mystery, of course, to this day exactly what. It was about 2 weeks in which he had just basically shut down. So that's the life of Thomas Aquinas. As I say, if there's any central theme that occurs to me at least as dominating his life, it was this desire to bring all truth regardless of its character, scientific truth, philosophical truth, truth of art, truth of course, theology, all of it, to bring it, in a sense, under submission to the authority of Christ. That seems to have been the driving force in his life. And of course, when he was a man of such genius, could make a lot of headway in making that point and having that kind of effect. It does occur to me that whether we happen to be a genius or not, it's a worthy quest. And when Paul says that he's the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation, all things are held together by him, it's a good reminder for us. We all live very distinct lives with all kinds of different issues floating around, but there is this quest, I think, that should fill the heart of every Christian person to say, all of these things that are part of my life, the job I have, the home I have, the kids I have, the grandkids, the involvements, the responsibilities here or there, the vocations and avocations, all of these things, how can all of them be brought in credible truth into submission to Christ, so that he is in fact at the heart of all things in my life? That's the beginning, really, of what a Christian life is all about. And then our great quest is, as Thomas did, to bring everything else, into submission to the Lord Jesus Christ. So Thomas is a great example of a guy that was devoted to that, and I hope that's been an interesting little glimpse into his career.